This fragile reel of tape contains the voice of one of the most feared men in history. Everyone knows his name. This is a fragment of the only existing tape recording of Adolf Hitler speaking privately, not as a screaming actor on the world stage, but as a human being, using the full power of his personality, trying to bend others to his will. This recording is an extraordinary window into the mind and madness of one of history's most terrifying figures. This is the Adolf Hitler we think we know. But this is just a caricature, images culled from the Nazi propaganda machine. But there was another hidden Adolf Hitler, a soft-spoken, almost charming conversationalist. During his reign of terror, Hitler let his guard down only once. When his voice was captured not on stage, but behind closed doors.
Hätte ich im Jahre 39 erledigt, dann wäre die Weltgeschichte anders gelaufen.
When I heard the tape for the first time, it became much more clear to me why other politicians had, for some time at least, believed into Hitler's words.
This tape was recorded in a private train car in Finland on June 4th, 1942. The man to whom Hitler was speaking was Marshal Carl Gustaf Mannerheim, Commander-in-Chief of the Finnish Armed Forces.
The Finnish recording is the only one of its kind. I think it is a key to understand the way how Hitler dealt with his partners, his style, the way he tries to seduce Mannerheim, to convince him.
Gustaf Mannerheim is still revered in Finland. He led Finland in their fight for independence from Russia in 1917. And during the Second World War, Mannerheim fought against two of the 20th century's most lethal regimes. As a token of a nation's continuing esteem, his personal train has been preserved as a museum. Inside a private room in this car, radio technician Tor Demain recorded over 11 minutes of Hitler speaking privately with Mannerheim. Today, this extraordinary recording lies hidden in the sound archives of the Finnish National Broadcasting Company in Helsinki. Within this archive, 300,000 tapes are stored, but this tape is like no other.
I have said always that this tape is the most valuable tape in our archive because it is the only tape in the world where Hitler speaks freely.
Adolf Hitler was defined by his public image, and that image was carefully manufactured by the Nazis. The Nazis turned propaganda into a fine art and a deadly weapon. A terrifying but persuasive lie that millions believed. The leading player in all of this was Adolf Hitler. Hitler's image was complex. He needed the Germans to believe in him, to love him, and to fear him. He accumulated absolute power by developing a pseudo-religious mystical cult of personality.
Hitler could act well enough, his acting style and so, but he was put there by the masses. If he had spoken like a priest, no one would have listened.
Hitler adapted his image to each situation. Here, addressing Parliament, he spoke diplomatically, playing the intelligent statesman. Here, with industrialists, he spoke and dressed like a businessman. When Hitler addressed Nazi party meetings, playing the rabble-rouser, his tone is unmistakably violent.
Nicht der Staat befiehlt uns, sondern wir befehlen den Staate!
The pictures you can see made of Hitler in the papers and books are censored. For instance, you will never see Hitler with his hands in his pocket.
Hitler with his hands in his pockets might appear relaxed, and that was precisely the image he did not want to project. Hitler's public image wasn't only built up by the propaganda machine, it was also refined and distilled, stripped down to the bare essentials.
In Germany there was a strict censorship, especially with everything dealing with the Führer, the leader himself. Photographs as well as interviews were strictly controlled.
Hitler's public image presented him as a superman, endowed with godlike powers. Here in the film Triumph of the Will, the message is clear. Hitler is descending from the heavens like a deity. This deity had no time for friendship or family, no time to even drink alcohol. He devoted his life to the power and resurgent glory of the new Germany. Throughout all the propaganda, Hitler's image is that of a solitary man standing in the eye of a hurricane of hate that he himself had created. He was a consummate actor, always aware that the eyes of a mass audience were upon him, and in front of that audience, he could be whoever he wanted to be. Today, his speeches have been excerpted and edited in ways that obliterate their original meaning. But when Hitler is allowed to speak within the original context, his power of persuasion is unmistakable. For example, in April 1939, Hitler was at the height of his power and popularity in Germany. He had executed a series of conquests without bloodshed, occupying Austria and part of Czechoslovakia. His new order was on the march, and nobody knew just how far Hitler was prepared to go. It was almost 5 months before the war started, and almost 2 years before the attack on Pearl Harbor. The United States was still neutral, and President Roosevelt was trying to head off a war he saw on the horizon. Roosevelt sends Hitler a telegram of concern, listing the countries he thought Hitler was targeting. Hitler replies in one of his best public performances, a twisted, stand-up comic routine.
Herr Roosevelt verlangt endlich die Bereitwilligkeit, ihm die Zusicherung zu geben, dass die deutschen Streitkräfte das Staatsgebiet oder die Besitzungen folgender unabhängiger Nationen nicht angreifen und vor allem nicht dort einmarschieren würden. Und er nennt als dafür in Frage kommend nun Finnland, Lettland, Litauen, Estland, Norwegen, Schweden, Dänemark, Niederlande, Belgien, Großbritannien, Irland, Frankreich, Portugal, Spanien, die Schweiz, Liechtenstein, Luxemburg, Polen, Ungarn, Rumänien, Jugoslawien, Russland, Bulgarien, Türkei, Irak, Arabien, Syrien, Palästina, Ägypten.
Hitler would, of course, invade more than half of the countries on Roosevelt's list. But lying came easily to Adolf Hitler. And he was one of the first modern politicians to truly understand the awesome power and influence of the media. He and his advisors micromanaged every public appearance.
He played a role. It was different roles, as we know, meanwhile, but performance was part of his nature.
And that makes this tape so extraordinary. Not just because someone managed to record it, but because of the way Hitler sounds. Charming, relaxed, perhaps most shockingly, completely reasonable. This is nothing like the Hitler we think we know. So much so that some believe this recording is a forgery.
Sometimes it feels okay, but at other points not. I have the feeling it's someone mimicking Hitler.
Could this carefully modulated voice really be that of Adolf Hitler? Dr. Stefan Graffurer, head of forensic speech analysis at the Bundeskriminalamt, the German FBI, will help unravel this mystery.
Is it Hitler's voice in this short sample we have, or is it somebody mimicking him?
And if this really is the private Hitler, what was he saying?
35.000 Panzer. Wir haben zurzeit über 34.000 Panzer vernichtet.
Did he divulge secrets that might rewrite the history of World War II? The investigation continues.
Wenn mir ein General von mir erklärt hätte, dass hier im Staat 35.000 Panzer in dieser Ziel, dann hätten sie alles doppelt oder zehnfach. Das ist Wahnsinn, das ist ein Gespenster.
This unique recording of Adolf Hitler speaking privately captures a side of Hitler never before heard. For this reason, some believe it may be a hoax.
Das war schon im Herbst 1940 für uns ununterbrochen die Frage, soll man es auf einen Bruch ankommen lassen?
It really sounds as if someone is mimicking him.
The truth is in the details. Hitler's sworn enemy, the Soviet Union, had invaded and occupied part of Finland in November 1939. Nearly 2 years later, after Hitler invaded Russia, unoccupied Finland used the opportunity to attack Russia and reclaim its lost territory. 1 year later, Adolf Hitler decided to travel to Finland for the first time, to meet face-to-face with Finnish Field Marshal Gustav Mannerheim.
He prepared this visit several weeks before his trip to Finland, but he kept his plans in total secrecy. And one day before, this means the 3rd of June 1942, he gave some information to Mannerheim himself that he will come next day. He wanted to keep the trip secret.
June 4th was Mannerheim's birthday, and Hitler planned on attending. Mannerheim's birthdays had once been cause for public celebration, but now because of the war, they were celebrated in secret. And this was no party. It was a strategic necessity. Mannerheim and Finland were trapped between two tyrants, hoping one would destroy the other.
Der Führer verlässt das Hauptquartier des Generalfeldmarschall von Bock.
In June 1942, Hitler was unquestionably the most powerful man on the planet. He had devastated the Soviet Union, and just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the United States was only beginning to recover. Hitler's war was going well, but not well enough, and this was no birthday celebration.
Well, I think the moment for Hitler's visit to Finland was chosen very cleverly. On the one hand, it was in the broader context of grand strategy.
Hitler's lightning war, his blitzkrieg, had bogged down in the Soviet Union. He needed the Finns to fight by his side, to tie down as much of the massive Soviet army as possible.
Hitler understood the meeting with Mannerheim very much as the meeting of two soldiers. He wished to meet him as a comrade in arms.
Hitler's day began here in East Prussia. Today it is an overgrown forest. In the summer of 1942, these ruined bunkers housed the command center of the Nazi military state. This was the infamous Wolf's Lair. Hitler usually stays up very late and likes to sleep until noon. But on the morning of June 4th, Adolf Hitler has an appointment to keep. At 8:35 a.m., his private plane, a converted Focke-Wulf 200 Condor bomber, rolls onto this airstrip and prepares to take off. But there is a problem. The brakes are jammed, a sometimes lethal design flaw of the Condor. These brake drums could catch fire on takeoff, and when the wheels are retracted, the burning tires could be lying directly under the fuel tanks. The problem is fixed, and Hitler takes off. The security arrangements for Hitler's flight were intense. All along his flight path, anti-aircraft guns were ready to repel any threat from the air. In the Baltic Sea, Finnish and German boats patrolled, ready to fight or ready to rescue. Nothing was left to chance.
Landung auf einem Flugplatz hinter der finnischen.
This Nazi newsreel documented the historic visit, and the making of this newsreel shows just how carefully Hitler's public image was controlled. Here, as Finland's President Ryti greets Hitler, two men carrying equipment run into frame and out again. 2 seconds later, two Finnish cameramen enter. What this edited film cleverly conceals is that when Hitler landed in Finland, his plane narrowly missed hitting a factory chimney, braking so hard on landing that one wheel caught fire. But the Finnish camera crew captured the burning tire, a tire blazing immediately below the fuel tanks. The German cameraman, knowing that Hitler was in a perilous situation, starts filming as Hitler climbs down through the smoke. This arrival sequence is later rescued in the cutting room. These extras are not carrying cameras. They are carrying fire extinguishers. This is just one example of how Hitler's image was manipulated. How nothing would compromise what today would be called a photo op. Hitler has to see and smell smoke from this burning rubber, but he pretends it isn't happening. He maintains his focus on his image. While these official greetings were being filmed at the airfield, sound engineer Tor Domain set up microphones inside Mannerheim's special train. In the dining car, Hitler was to record a short speech for public consumption in Finland.
They prepared the train. They put several microphones in the restaurant wagon where Marshal Mannerheim received the guests.
Domain had positioned two microphones between the luggage racks over Mannerheim's table in the dining car. The cable ran outside to where Domain had set up his recording equipment, two state-of-the-art reel-to-reel tape recorders. They wired these microphones securely to fit the space, hiding them in birch leaves so they were nearly invisible. At this table, they served Hitler his own special meal, a food taster having made sure the dish was not poisoned. The official speeches were recorded in the dining car, but the true affairs of state would be discussed in the privacy of Mannerheim's personal salon car. The public speech was recorded as planned, and then the men adjourned for a more personal meeting. As the men walked across the plank to the salon car, Domain hastily moved his microphones to the new location. He wanted to be prepared in case any more official remarks needed to be recorded. Hitler began a casual but secret conversation with Mannerheim. It was time for his real work, his personal persuasion, to begin. But outside, Tor Domain makes a momentous decision. Having set up his microphones, he decides to keep recording the now private conversation.
Sie haben die ungeheuerste Rüstung, die menschendenkbar ist. Also, wenn mir jemand gesagt hätte, dass ein Staat...
Henrik Domain is Tor's son. The story of how this recording was made has become family legend, beginning with the secret installation of the microphones.
Since my father was responsible for the recording there, so he found out that he couldn't record. The microphones were in the wrong car, so he took a microphone and went to the salon wagon which had a window open, and he threw the microphone up to the baggage compartment.
Wenn mir jemand gesagt hätte, dass ein Staat mit 35.000 Punks antreten kann, dann hätte ich gesagt, Sie sind Wahnsinn.
He thought that he will make a good service for his army and his fatherland.
Tor Domain put himself in mortal danger. The SS men guarding Hitler were trained to shoot first and ask questions later. Putting on his headphones, Demain began to listen to the most significant sound recording of his life. But after 11 minutes, Hitler's guards realized what Tor Demain was doing.
A German officer noticed, and he demanded to stop immediately to record the conversation.
One of the German guards pointed a finger at Demain and made a cutting gesture across his throat. Incredibly, the Germans didn't shoot, and though they were furious, they didn't even confiscate the tape.
And said, if this had happened in Germany, you have cut your head off.
Apparently, the recording was saved because the SS guards didn't dare tarnish Hitler's media event. As shooting a Finn for spying or destroying Finnish radio property would have caused a major diplomatic conflict with one of Germany's most vital allies. The guards had to find a compromise. They ordered the tape to be sealed, never to be opened. These broken wax seals are still on the tape box.
Afterwards, naturally, the Finns opened the boxes and listened what Hitler had told to Mannerheim.
Then, the tape vanished into history. June 4th, 1942. Adolf Hitler had turned Europe into a slaughterhouse. On this day, Hitler's final solution is exterminating thousands of Jews at the newly constructed death camps at Sobibor, Treblinka, and Belchis. But 700 miles away in Finland, the architect of this Holocaust was enjoying a friendly lunch, speaking candidly to Finland's leader Gustav Mannerheim about how his war is going. This 11-minute conversation was captured by Finnish radio technician Tor Demain. Those who have heard it believe it provides an extraordinary perspective of the private Adolf Hitler, the Hitler who seduced a nation.
Alle dabei waren, Panzerverbände hier für den Osten fertig zu machen, mussten wir nun in einem Schlag zwei geschlossene Divisionen abgeben.
But to one man, this tape is no historical treasure, it is a fraud.
He is speaking normally, but I have problems with the tone. The intonation isn't quite right.
Rokas Misch was at Hitler's beck and call from 1940 to the dictator's suicide in 1945, and Misch was also Hitler's private switchboard operator. If anyone still living knows Hitler, it is Misch. For as Hitler's private operator, he could distinguish Hitler's voice from all the other Nazi leaders.
Die deutschen Fahrzeuge, die sind nicht erprobt worden, sie etwa für den Winterkrieg herzurichten.
Sometimes it seems okay, but at other points not. I have the feeling it's someone mimicking Hitler.
Ich weiß, was Finnland in diesem ganzen Kampf zu leisten hat, in den ganzen Jahren, wie schwere Opfer sind das finnische Volk bringt.
Well, if Misch finds this voice pleasant, this is not surprising to me, because I guess that his experience with Hitler's voice was in a totally different setting.
In order to definitively prove that this is Hitler's voice, we asked audio analyst Stefan Grafura to compare this tape with the other Hitler recording made a few minutes earlier on the same microphone.
He splice together segments of speech from the two different recordings. And we usually do this in order to listen if there's a sudden change in verbal behavior or in how the voice sounds. And what we find here is that it stays exactly the same. So it's obvious for us that it is one voice.
Der Entschluss, der Entschluss, der Entschluss, der Entschluss, der Entschluss.
Our analysis leaves no doubt. This is Adolf Hitler. As close as Rokas Misch was to Hitler, he was not close enough to ever hear this voice. People are surprised at how pleasant he seems. But what can account for this relaxed, almost charming, low-key voice? There might be a very unscientific explanation. Hitler may have been drinking alcohol at lunch.
I do know he would drink Fernet Branca before addressing a big gathering. He drank a digestive spirit.
Contrary to the Nazi propaganda legend that always portrayed him as being disciplined and sober. In fact, Hitler seems to have a glass of some spirit in front of him here with Mannerheim.
And I saw him drinking beer, traveling in the train, in the restaurant car. I was eating there and I saw him drinking a beer, a Holzkirchner Bräu.
This extraordinary series of photographs of the meeting, taken by a Finnish military photographer, also reveals a discrepancy in the Demain family legend of a secretly placed microphone.
The microphones were in the wrong car, so he took a microphone and went to the salon wagon which had a window open, and he threw the microphone up to the baggage compartment.
There's no microphone on this picture where it's obvious this is the conversation between Mannerheim and Hitler. On this picture there's also a microphone that is obviously visible and not hidden at all. So if this is the same room where the conversation was recorded, then the microphone was obviously not hidden.
Thor Demain's microphone was plainly visible. Hitler could not have missed it. But no one told him the tape was still rolling, and what it captured is extraordinary.
The secret tape shows that he has a broader spectrum of behavior, of performances, than one would expect. You couldn't distinguish him from any serious statesman in the world when listening to the tape.
Armed with this new evidence, we can now go back in time to 1942 and hear a different side of World War II, directly from the mouth of the man who started it. This is the only existing recording of how Adolf Hitler presented himself behind closed doors.
Als ich bewegen kann. Und es war dauernder Regenwetter und nun kenne ich ja dieses französische Gebiet selber sehr gut.
Hitler was caught speaking candidly with Finnish military leader Karl Mannerheim as part of a carefully choreographed ballet of deception. The conversation seems pleasant, one friend to another. But what did Mannerheim really feel about Hitler? Raw footage taken that same day provides some clues. Here, Hitler is clearly putting on a show, but Mannerheim listens skeptically. He seems bored, politely hiding his irritation. Here, Hitler presents Mannerheim with a gift of 2 armored staff cars. But as soon as Mannerheim breaks eye contact with Hitler, he looks irritated. But alone with his Finnish soldiers and politicians, Mannerheim is very relaxed, treating his comrades with affection. But here, his expression conveys dislike and distrust of Hitler. While the cameras recorded Hitler crossing the plank to Mannerheim's train, a Finnish photographer caught a candid image. As Hitler almost clowns on the gangplank, in the background, Mannerheim smiles, his expression enigmatic, a symbol of a tense relationship strained by the Finns' adamant refusal to directly cooperate in any way with Hitler's Holocaust. Finland had even saved the lives of thousands of foreign Jewish refugees by moving them over their border to neutral Sweden.
There were Jewish soldiers in the Finnish army, a very tragic situation of soldiers fighting along the Germans for a cause of which they didn't know what would come out, and it would be a tragedy, especially to the Jewish soldiers, whether they would win or lose.
But for the moment at least, Hitler needed Finland as much as Finland temporarily needed Germany.
diese riesige Umstellung unserer Divisionen vom Westen nach dem Osten vorgenommen während der ersten Besetzung in Norwegen.
Hitler's main purpose in making his visit to Finland was to convince the Finns to remain on Germany's side. And in order to do that, he had, first of all, to explain the German failures of the last winter.
Adolf Hitler was about to be trapped by his own words as he unwittingly reveals his true and sinister intentions. The discussion on the tape centers on the Soviet Union. On it, Hitler confesses that he underestimated their strength when he attacked in June of 1941.
Eine sehr große Gefahr, vielleicht die schwerste der ganzen Umgebung hat jetzt der letzte Kolonie. Wir wussten das selber auch nicht so ganz genau, wie ungeheuerlich diese Strafen müssen.
Mannerheim agreed. He had already fought the Red Army in the 1939 Winter War and had tested the Russian strength.
Natürlich hatten wir den Eindruck, dass sie gut gerüstet waren.
Wenn mir jemand gesagt hätte, dass ein Staat mit 35.000 Tanks antreten kann, dann hätte ich gesagt, sie sind wahnsinnig.
Here, Hitler talks like a businessman who has underestimated his competitors.
Wenn mir das jemand gesagt hätte, ich hätte gesagt, wenn mir ein General von mir erklärt hätte, dass hier ein Staat 35.000 Panzer in dieser Ziele hat, sie sind alles doppelt oder zehnfach. Das ist wahnsinnig, ein Gespenst.
Hitler tried to appear serious to Mannerheim, to give the impression of a competent leader whom you could trust.
But for Hitler, trust is just another weapon in his arsenal of deceit. Listen now to how he imparts a sense of shock and amazement at the Russian strength, but only to bolster his own credibility.
Heute ist das eine Panzerfabrik, die in der ersten Schichte etwas über 30.000 und in den Vollausbau über 60.000 Arbeiterbeschäftigte. Eine einzige Panzerfabrik. Die haben sie besetzt. Eine gigantische Fabrik.
One single tank factory, we occupied it, a gigantic tank factory. So he uses a lot of modulation to show that even he was impressed by this size.
Die haben sie besetzt. Eine gigantische Fabrik. Arbeitermassen, die allerdings die Tiere lieben.
On the tape, Hitler dramatizes his ignorance of Russian strength, at the same time brushing it aside to emphasize his own power. Mannerheim seems to agree.
Wenn man denkt, dass die 20 Jahre, über 20 Jahre, 25 Jahre Menschen Freiheit gehabt haben, sich zu rüsten. Und alles ausgegeben für Rüstung. Nur Rüstung.
This is the last time we hear Mannerheim speaking on the tape. From this point on, Hitler talks in an uninterrupted monologue. Now Hitler the actor takes over. Listen to how he makes himself sound weak and vulnerable. Treaties only served to buy Hitler time. Even before the Hitler-Stalin Pact was signed, he was planning to attack Soviet Russia. But first, he needed to conquer France, an invasion successfully concluded by the summer of 1940. On the tape, he reveals that he wanted to invade 6 months earlier.
Noch im Herbst 39 wollte ich einfach noch den Westen mehr zu tun. Nur dieses dauernde schlechte Wetter, das wir haben. Unsere ganze Bewaffnung war ja, es ist eine Schönwetterbewaffnung. Der wichtigste ist gut, aber seit der ältesten Zeit her, da kann man nicht Krieg führen.
Hitler then speaks about late 1939, the period when Stalin attacked Finland, and Hitler was planning to attack France, the first major step on the road to subjugating Europe.
Wir sind im Herbst 1939 immer vor der Frage gestanden, ich wollte in der alten Stellung angreifen und ich war überzeugt, dass sie in 6 Wochen mit Frankreich fertig werden wollen.
Hitler is boasting, and his hubris is audible.
He wanted to attack under all conditions, so this is very strong.
Hitler's blitzkrieg tactics depended on all conditions being favorable. Hitler had invaded France once before as a soldier in World War I.
Kann der Nordkant der Serbien 4 Jahre lang zurück im Großen Krieg. Und so kam diese Verzögerung. Hätte ich im Jahre 39 erledigt, dann wäre die Weltgeschichte anders gelaufen. So musste ich bis zum März 1940.
Hitler did not shrink from telling the truth about his conquest of France, a nation which had wanted to help the Finns in 1939. It is not surprising that Karl Mannerheim, an officer and a gentleman, had fallen silent.
Ich konnte im September oder Oktober mit unseren Waffen keinen Krieg mehr beginnen, das war ja unmöglich.
Soon the conversation would turn to a matter of life and death for both men. War with the Soviet Union. A war that shockingly Hitler claims he did not want.
Davor hatte ich eine große Sorge, daher auch mit Bestreben, Verhandlungen, diese Zeit zu überwinden, bis wir stark genug waren.
Is it possible that Adolf Hitler sincerely wanted peace, not war? June 4th, 1942. For Hitler, seduction was just as effective a weapon as threats. He mainly left the bullying and threatening to his SS and Gestapo underlings.
He was a good speaker. He could inspire people with his style of speaking. That was his strength too. It was also his strength when he faced his admirals and generals. He could assert himself, even when they didn't agree with him.
Our analysis concludes that the tape is genuine. But how genuine was Hitler? In his cold-blooded calculus, one of the reasons he invaded Russia was simply to ensure access to nearby Romanian oil.
Weil ich immer eine Angst hatte, dass Russland im Spätherbst plötzlich Rumänien überfällt, sich in den Besitz der Petroleumquellen setzt. Und wir werden ja im Spätherbst 1940 noch nicht fertig gewesen. Wenn nun Russland die rumänischen Petroleumquellen besetzt hätte, dann wäre ja Deutschland verloren.
In war, access to raw materials can mean the difference between victory and defeat. Hitler had positioned an army of 200,000 German soldiers in northern Scandinavia to secure the vital nickel mines there. But the tape reveals that Hitler suspected that Stalin was eyeing the Romanian oil fields to the south.
Auch nur die Petroleumquellen besetzen. Ich konnte im September oder Oktober mit unseren Waffen keinen Krieg mehr beginnen, das war ja unmöglich. Wir haben eine große deutsche Produktion, aber was allein die Luftwaffe verschlingt, was unsere Panzerdivisionen verschlingen, das ist denn doch etwas ganz Ungeheures. Das ist ein Rauch, der über alle Vorstellungen weggeht.
But Hitler couldn't stop now. By attacking Russia, Hitler had placed the German Reich in a fight to the death.
When Germany attacked the Soviet Union, they decided to sell this attack as a preventive war, which could be seen as a moral justification for the attack.
Hitler didn't attack Russia because he thought Stalin was threatening Germany. Hitler attacked because he thought Stalin was weak. It would be a fatal miscalculation.
Germany's overall situation in the summer of 1942 was pretty desperate.
Hitler was masterful at playing the victim. Every war he began was presented as an act of self-defense. The invasion of Russia was no different.
Diese Zeit zu überwinden, bis wir stark genug waren, diesen erpresserischen Forderungen entgegenzuwirken. Die Forderungen waren dann einfach nackte Erpressung. Es sind Erpression gewesen. Die Russen wussten, dass wir uns nicht helfen konnten, dass wir fest an den Punkten waren. Sie konnten uns alles erpressen.
Now, Hitler casually circles back to the subject that had brought him to Mannerheim, Finland. This is the heart of the conversation, where Hitler has to persuade Mannerheim that he has always looked out for Finland's welfare. Even Hitler knew full well that was a lie. Back in 1939, during the brief period when Hitler and Stalin were allies, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov had been keen to stake the Soviet claim to the Finnish territories.
Erst bei dem Besuch von Molotov waren die vier Punkte, der eine Punkt, der Finnland betraf, Freiheit sich vor den finnischen Bedrohungen zu schützen, sagte dann mir dass Finnland sie bedroht.
In this part of the recording where he's telling the story about his conversation with Molotov, he's not just telling what happened, or not describing the situation, he's really acting it out. Maybe in order to be more credible.
Ja, ihre Existenz ist doch nicht von Finnland bedroht. Da sage ich ihm, wir würden einen weiteren Krieg in der Ostsee würden wir nicht mehr als passive Zuschauer hinnehmen können.
Hitler seems to be trying to deceive Mannerheim by saying he had warned Molotov that Germany would intervene if Russia were to attack Finland. Because at exactly this time, the fall of 1939, Hitler was making his unholy pact with Stalin. The Hitler-Stalin pact had a secret clause that gave Finland to Stalin. This was the real reason why Hitler had not helped Finland when the Soviets attacked them in 1939. But the Finns knew nothing of this agreement.
They simply couldn't understand why the Germans, who in their perception had always taken part in favor of Finnish independence, now remained passive.
Hitler is performing at his best. Although he had handed Stalin Finland on a platter, he is acting as if he were the great defender of the Finns. As Hitler returned to the airstrip to fly home, he may have already known that he had failed in his mission. He had not convinced Mannerheim that Germany was a reliable ally. Hitler's war would grind on, and as the tide turned against Germany, so too would Finland. The reality of Hitler's attempted seduction of Mannerheim was finally made clear when he turned on the man whose birthday he had just celebrated. 2 years after this meeting, the Finns declared war on Germany and signed a peace treaty with the Soviet Union. The betrayed Finns had turned on their German betrayer. Hitler then dropped all pretense. He wanted revenge, and he ordered a scorched earth policy. Retreating German forces destroyed more than a third of all dwellings in Finnish Lapland. They burned entire cities to the ground, and they left the territory booby-trapped with mines. Ultimately, Hitler reveals his true character to the Finns, a character revealed by his actions, not his words.
Having heard Hitler speak the way he did with Mannerheim, it is easier to understand why others could believe him. He is convincing in the way he speaks, at least for those who wished to believe him.
It is shockingly easy to forget who you are listening to in this recording. The banality of evil has never been so apparent. When Hitler casually refers to the Soviet factory workers as animals, the consequences of this attitude would be the demise of literally millions of Soviet prisoners, worked and starved to death. When Hitler reflects upon invading France in 1939, rather than 6 months earlier, it is as if the horror and devastation brought by the Nazis was just a minor consequence. And looming over this conversation, like a malicious black cloud, is the Holocaust, which will forever define Adolf Hitler and his brutal brand of evil. At 6:10, the evil manipulator's work was over. Hitler said his farewells to Mannerheim and boarded his plane for the return flight. At exactly that moment, 6,000 miles away in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, one of the pivotal battles of the Second World War was beginning. American forces were engaging Japanese aircraft carriers in the Battle of Midway. The Japanese fleet would never recover. The tide of the war in the Pacific was turning. But as he flew home, Hitler knew nothing of the losses his number one ally had suffered. This accordion music signals the moment when Tour de Maine stopped his machine. The tape had been used once before to record a concert. But fortunately, Demain managed to preserve 11 minutes that remind us of a time when absolute evil wore a human face. 8 months later, Hitler's forces suffer a catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad. The war that Hitler's powers of persuasion began ends in suicide in the bowels of his bunker. This tape lives on as a connection with the past and stands forever as a warning for the future.
We know Adolf Hitler as the incarnation of evil.
Und niemals vertragen und niemals verzweifeln.
The architect of the destruction of Europe. The man responsible for the bloodiest crimes in history.
Und ich glaube nicht, dass die Gegner, die damals noch gelacht haben, heute auch noch lachen.
He rose to power, portraying himself as the savior of the German people. But what lay behind this facade? In 1943, at the height of the war, the American Secret Service tried to get inside the mind of the Führer. They ordered a team of Harvard psychologists to put together a top-secret psychological profile of Hitler to try and work out what he might do next.
We want to know as much as possible about the things that make him tick.
You're asking for something that's never been done before, Bill.
Under enormous pressure, they poured through documents.
We all know this isn't going to be easy.
Tracked down people who knew the Führer.
His long, sallow face was contorted and tears flowed from his eyes.
And argued about what it all meant.
But you can't say that.
All right.
They recorded every word of this investigation in detail.
As you got older, infantile sexual feelings were probably quite prominent in this relationship.
And what they discovered was shocking.
She said she'd be glad to sleep with him if that was all he wanted.
A disturbing cocktail of abuse, obsession, and sexual perversion. And on this basis, the American psychologists made a series of amazingly accurate predictions about Hitler's future conduct. 2 years before the end of the war. Did that mean they had succeeded in getting inside the mind of Adolf Hitler? This man is Dr. Gerald Post. He is an internationally renowned expert in the discipline of political profiling. He has analyzed more political leaders than anyone else in the world. He worked for the CIA in the 70s, setting up their first publicly acknowledged profiling unit.
This is it. Fantastic.
And the psychological profile of Adolf Hitler is where it all started.
Well, in many ways, it's like the holy grail for my field. This was really the very first disciplined study of a political leader at a distance using a psychoanalytic framework, and in many ways was really the inspiration for the unit I came to found at the Central Intelligence Agency.
This is the first time that Dr. Post has had the original report in his hands, and he's never seen the more than 1,000 pages of the profile's background research. This isn't just an opportunity for Post to revisit the past. It's also a chance to see if the analysis of Hitler's troubled mind stands up to modern scrutiny. By the end of 1942, Adolf Hitler had only been in power for 9 years. In that decade, he had transformed Germany, and his armies had swept all before them in Europe. He seemed invincible. defeat at Stalingrad in January 1943 signaled the beginning of the end for Hitler's dreams of a 1,000-year Reich. In 2 years, it would be all over. Yet that's not something the Allies could have predicted in the winter of 1943.
I think the temptation has always been there to look back at the war from 1945 backwards, and so 1942-43 seems to be the point at which the Allies took the initiative and gradually squeezed the Axis until they'd won. But if you stand in 1943, beginning of 1943, things look very different, very uncertain. The German army is deep in Russia. Allied shipping is under severe submarine threat. In 1943, it was by no means certain that the war would be finished in 2 years. By no means certain the Allies would win.
The Allies also feared that Hitler was on the verge of taking the war to another level. They knew that German scientists were developing the technology to launch missiles with the potential to deliver an atomic bomb.
For the Allies, it's clearly very important to understand what makes Hitler tick, because this might be the man who finally says yes to biological weapons, or weapons of mass destruction, as we call them now. This is the man who might say, push on with the atomic weapons program, and he'll drop an atomic bomb on London. You can't be sure, given everything that Hitler's done up to now, quite how this man is going to behave.
To the German people. We need something more reliable than what we get from the German propaganda machine as stuff our foreign correspondents feed us. What we need is a realistic appraisal of the German situation. If Hitler is running the show, what kind of guy is he? What are his ambitions? How does he appear to the German people? What's he like with his associates? What's his background? But most of all, we want to know as much as possible about his psychological makeup, things that make him tick. And we also want to know what he might do if things begin to go against him. Now, do you think you can come up with something along these lines?
You're asking for something that's never been done before, Bill.
That doesn't mean to say it can't be done, and you're just the man to do it.
Well, that's very flattering, Bill, but I don't know how valuable it'll be.
Why?
Well, we'd have to get most of our information from the literature. And while that's extensive, for the most part, it's unreliable. Furthermore, psychological and psychoanalytical techniques are designed for this sort of thing.
Now, if anybody can make this work, it's you, Walter. Just give it a try and see what you come up with. Hire what help you need and get it done as soon as possible. And another thing, keep it brief and make it readable to the layman.
Wir heute Deutschland in stolzer Freude seine Söhne in euch agieren sehen.
This was the public face of Adolf Hitler. He'd risen to power in the 1920s, when the country was on the verge of economic and social collapse. He pledged to revitalize and rebuild Germany. And this was a message that the German people were desperate to hear.
For Hitler, there was a very real, almost lock and key fit between his own psychological needs and the needs of the damaged German populace. They each gave to each other something that made this more powerful than either the leader or the followers independently.
For a long time, historians were prone to see Hitler as an aberration, an extraordinary Pied Piper who suddenly turned up in Germany, played his pipe, and the Germans followed blindly behind him. Almost all the recent history, though, of the Third Reich has shown the extent to which Hitler, in very important ways, represented much of German society. represented German values, that he was leading a nationalist revolution as much as causing one. And I think that that's made it possible for us to place Hitler more realistically in the context of German history, and not to see him as some kind of alien figure who was suddenly foisted on the German people.
By the mid-1930s, Hitler had established his dictatorship, systematically dismantling German democratic institutions. What Lange was looking for was the private man behind the public face. He was trying to find the deep roots of Hitler's rages and hatreds.
Welcome. Thank you for coming. Thanks. Good to see you. Good to see you again.
Under enormous time pressures, he needed help. He put together a small team of psychologists and researchers.
We all know this isn't going to be easy. All we're going to get is a mass of raw material that's been gathered from innumerable sources. None of it's going to be firsthand, and none of it's going to be obtained under the controlled conditions of personal psychoanalysis. We can't put Hitler on the couch. Furthermore, it's almost a foregone conclusion that a lot of the information we're going to dig up is going to prove to be untrustworthy and irrelevant. It's a challenge. But we've got no alternative.
Now, tell me about your mother.
All of this research was analyzed through the lens of Freudianism. The business of psychology has boomed in the second half of the 20th century, spawning a panoply of different analytical approaches. But in America, in 1943, one particular version of Freudianism dominated, a version which placed heavy emphasis on childhood experiences.
It seemed like Mom spent most of her time helping Dad with his business. I guess she didn't have much time left over for me, even when I was sick.
For Freud, the personality was constructed in childhood. This, for him, was the crucible where all humans were made. The problem for Lange and his team was that Hitler had been very careful to virtually obliterate his past. They'd very little to go on. What they did know was that Hitler had 3 brothers who all died young, and 2 sisters. They were also aware that his father was a drunken brute who beat the young Adolf regularly. And, for Lange, that would almost certainly have a significant effect on Hitler's psyche.
Under such circumstances, the child becomes confused and is unable to identify himself with a clear-cut pattern that he can use as a guide for his own adjustment. Not only is this a severe handicap in itself, but in addition, the child is given a distorted picture of the world around him and the nature of the people in it.
The void is created in childhood. It represents what we've come to call the wounded self. And in Hitler's case, we really have to go back several generations to be understanding what was so troubling to this man. He described a very sadistic father, Alois, 22 years older than his mother, who was violent with the children, would beat the dog until it urinated. At one point left Hitler for dead after a savage beating.
Lange suspected that Hitler's abusive father would drive him into the arms of his mother, which would have profound psychological consequences. Lange was presented with an opportunity to test this theory when he tracked down the Hitler family doctor in New York. His name was Dr. Eduard Bloch. He was Jewish and had escaped from Austria when the Nazis annexed the country in 1938.
Did Hitler have any medical problems?
Oh, I only treated him for minor colds, of course measles. He was a good child.
But he had no physical deformity, and definitely no tuberculosis, although tuberculosis was hereditary in the family from the father's side.
Well, I suppose if that's the case, you can't have known him very well.
On the contrary, I was the Hitler family doctor. I got to know them all very well when I was treating his mother for breast cancer. I gave her an injection every day.
What was Hitler like with his mother?
Well, I have to say that the relationship between mother and son, their reciprocal adoration, was unusual.
How did this manifest itself?
When I summoned Hitler and his two sisters, who were married, they didn't live at home, and when I summoned them to my office to tell them their mother was gravely ill with no hope of recovery, his reaction to this news was touching. His long, sallow face was contorted, tears flowed from his eyes. The girls, on the other hand, received the news with calm reserve. Only then did I realize the magnitude of the relationship that existed between mother and son.
When his mother finally died of breast cancer, Dr. Bloch was amazed at Hitler's reaction.
In the practice of my profession, it is, of course, quite natural that I should have witnessed many scenes such as this one. Yet none has left me with quite the same impression. In all my career, I have never seen anyone so prostrate with grief as Adolf Hitler. His mother would turn in her grave if she knew what he turned out to be.
For Hitler, his mother's grave became something of a shrine. There's evidence in one of the many home movies shot by Hitler's lover, Eva Braun. This one shows Hitler, Eva, and some friends on a trip to Leonding, where the Führer grew up, and the site of his mother's grave. Her son covered the tombstone in Nazi icons and memorabilia. Eva took no moving pictures of Hitler at the graveside, but there are a series of telling still images.
Every scrap of evidence indicates there was an extremely strong attachment between Hitler and his mother. This was due in part to the fact that she had lost 2 or possibly 3 children before Adolf was born. And since he too was frail as a child, it's natural that she'd do everything in her power to guard against the recurrence of her earlier tragedy. And the result was that she catered to his whims, even to the point of spoiling him, and that she was overprotective in her attitude toward him.
For Langer's team, Hitler's infatuation with his mother and loathing for his father was a perfect fit for Freud's famous Oedipus complex.
Life with his mother must have been a veritable paradise for Adolf, except for the fact of when his father would intrude and disrupt the happy relationship. As he got older, infantile sexual feelings were probably quite prominent in this relationship. This is the Oedipus complex. The more he hated his father, the more dependent he became upon the affection and love of his mother. And the more he loved his mother, the more afraid he became of his father's vengeance should he be discovered.
Every little boy, as he is desperately wanting the total love of his mother, comes to see his father as a rival. This, however, can be particularly powerful if you have had an overly attentive mother, as Hitler did, and an abusive father, as Hitler did. But with that abusive authority, there is on the one hand the wish to get rid of him, but on the other hand, the fear of his power, which is represented in the so-called castration complex.
For a Freudian like Langer, this extreme castration anxiety could manifest itself in adulthood in the fear of syphilis. Freud even had a name for it: syphiliphobia.
Throughout Mein Kampf, he comes back to the topic of syphilis again and again, and spends almost an entire chapter describing its horrors. In almost all cases, we find that a fear of this sort is rooted in a fear of genital injury during childhood.
Langer continued to examine Hitler's childhood through the lens of Freudianism.
I mean, we're doing as best we can with what we have.
For the father of psychology, there were 5 clearly delineated stages of growing up. And what Langer was looking for was signs that one of the stages had gone wrong. Because, according to Freud, if they did, there would be profound psychological consequences. Dr. Bloch provided corroborating evidence for this theory.
Hitler and his mother lived in a rented apartment. It was a small place, rather poor. My predominant impression of this simple furnished apartment was its cleanliness. Oh, it glistened. Not a speck of dirt on the chairs or the tables, not a stray fleck of mud on the scrubbed floor, not a smudge on the panes of the windows. Frau Hitler was a superb housekeeper.
Hitler's mother's obsessive cleanliness was significant for Langer. It indicated that the toilet training phase of Hitler's childhood might have gone wrong.
Now, you can't say that.
All right. Well, how about this? From what we know about his mother's excessive cleanliness and tidiness, we may assume she employed rather stringent measures during the toilet training period of the children. We know this usually results in a residual tension in this area. It's regarded by the child as a severe frustration that arouses feelings of hostility. Now, this facilitates an alliance with his infantile aggression that finds an avenue for expression through anal activities and fantasies. These usually center around soiling, humiliation, and destruction, and form the basis of a sadistic character.
Aber dass die Partei weiterleben wird, das weiß ich, und dass über alle Personen, über Schwach und Stark hinweg die Zukunft der deutschen Nation erfolgreich gestalten wird, das glaube ich und das weiß ich.
Langer felt that he had a potential fit for Freud's Oedipus complex and extreme difficulties with the toilet training stage of childhood. And he suspected that this would be most clearly seen in Hitler's attitudes to sex. Sex, for Freud, was crucial to what drove and determined people. And in Freudian analysis, an anally retentive personality might well appear apparently disinterested in sex or asexual. According to the man who ran the Berghof, Hitler's stunning Alpine retreat, Hitler and his lover, Eva Braun, were never physically intimate.
My wife was always very curious, as was I, and she often did Hitler's washing. And the first thing she always did was to check if there had been any sexual activity. But there was never any evidence. My wife checked the sheets and there were no signs of sexual activity, none. And if we had private conversations with the chambermaids, they said the same. No traces could ever be found.
Niemals, nirgends. Niemals.
Langer didn't know this at the time, but he did know that Hitler was awkward around women and appeared to be asexual. This reinforced his belief that the Führer had something to hide.
I think it's important to think of individuals in layers. There's the layer we see on the surface, which for many is all that is seen and understood. And for many leaders, that layer is there to overcompensate for what is missing beneath. For Hitler, the magnitude of his weakness psychologically led to a drive psychologically to overcome that, and he developed this compensatory messianic self.
Heil Millionen!
And again, that's a surface picture on top of this empty self beneath, this wounded self from that rather cruel childhood.
But Langer didn't believe that Hitler could keep this weak, empty side of his personality permanently hidden. Following his version of Freud, he knew where to look. He suspected that it would express itself sexually. He was most interested in Hitler's relationship with his niece, Gyli Raubal. There was speculation in the Hitler literature that he was more than just an uncle to the teenager. He couldn't talk to Gyli because she had committed suicide in 1930, apparently following a row with Hitler. But Otto Strasser was close to Hitler and Gyli during this period. He was one of the founding members of the Nazi Party, along with his brother Gregor, seen here alongside Hitler at a party rally in 1927. But they both fell out with the Führer over the political direction of the party. Hitler later had Gregor murdered, and Otto escaped to Canada.
You knew Gyli Raubal?
Yes, I knew her very well. I took her out a few times.
And how did her uncle Adolf react?
He got very jealous when he found out. He finally forbade me from having any further contact with Gyli.
Did you see her again?
Yes. One morning, she appeared at my apartment in Munich, very upset. I let her in and tried to quieten her down. But all I could get out of her was that she didn't know what to do with her uncle.
What did she mean?
Well, she said that Hitler was very generous with her in some respects, and very harsh with her in others. And he frequently locked her up for long periods of time because she refused to do what he told her.
And what did you say?
I said to her, why don't you just sleep with him? What difference does it make if he's your uncle?
What did she say?
She said she'd be glad to sleep with him if that was all he wanted. But that she couldn't go through another performance again. I asked her what she meant. But she wouldn't tell me. I kept on asking. And finally she gave in.
What was the nature of this performance?
Well, she said that Hitler made her undress while he lay on the floor. Then she would have to squat down over his face while he examined her at close range. But this made him very excited. When his excitement reached its peak, he demanded that she urinate on him. And that gave him his sexual pleasure. Gyli said that she found the whole performance extremely disgusting. And although it was sexually stimulating for Hitler, it gave her no gratification whatsoever.
The Strasser evidence is hard to judge. There's no doubt that there was no love lost between Otto Strasser and Hitler. He is not, in that sense, an impartial witness. And the other problem, of course, is that we need a great deal more evidence, which is going to be very hard to get, to be certain that the thing he's saying is not just one of those titillating rumors which people spread about Hitler, and all the stuff about Hitler's homosexuality and so on, his sexual perversions. This was a kind of libel, if you like, which was more widespread in the 1930s, perhaps, than we might realize.
What's interesting about Strasser's material is it served to confirm analytic hunches that Langer had. It made sense psychologically. In the act of being subject in his perversion to being really sexually humiliated by a woman, that represented the unmasked wish to surrender, capitulate, be seen as a weak man against which he was forcefully quarreling psychologically and in his power, the power of the will. This was central for him. This was the highly potent, powerful leader. But underneath that was this man who was desperately weak and desperately afraid, and afraid of and yet seeking submission and capitulation.
Langer believed that Hitler found a way to deal with the terrible psychological consequences of his perversion by adapting a political ideology which was a prevalent and powerful part of mainstream European culture: anti-Semitism.
Hitler's outstanding defense mechanism is one commonly called projection. It's a technique by which the ego of an individual defends itself against unpleasant impulses, tendencies, or characteristics by denying their existence in himself while attributing them to others. From a psychological point of view, it's not too far-fetched to suppose that as the perversion developed and became more disgusting to Hitler's ego, its demands were disowned and projected upon the Jew.
At this time in 1943, Langer had no idea that Hitler's anti-Semitism would create the horrors of the Holocaust. For Langer, Hitler's hatreds were driven by fear and insecurity. Yet the Führer appeared to possess an almost superhuman self-confidence. The explanation for this apparent contradiction once again lay in Hitler's childhood. As Dr. Bloch confirmed, Hitler was a weak, frail little boy. But there was one thing that marked him out as special in his family. He survived. His three brothers didn't. They all died young. And that allowed Langer to make an important clinical deduction.
The thought of death is inconceivable to small children. But in Hitler's case, it was a living issue. And the fears of his mother, that she might lose him as well, were in all likelihood communicated to her.
And what does this mean for Hitler?
Well, in his immature way, he probably wondered why the others had died, while he continued to live. And it is natural for a child to draw the conclusion that he would be favored in some way, or that he was chosen to live for a particular purpose, that he was under divine protection.
Vor uns liegt Deutschland, in uns marschiert Deutschland und hinter uns kommt Deutschland.
This is what Freud called the Messiah complex. There's no question that Hitler believed he had Christ-like qualities.
It's really very important to understand Hitler, the Messiah, Hitler, the Savior. Indeed, he relished when people say, Heil Hitler, the Savior of the German people. And he identified, in fact, with Christ, but not Christ, the nurturing, loving Christ that we know of. Christ the fighter who had to fight against the Jews to keep from being destroyed.
Langer wanted more time to finish his profile, but Donovan and the Secret Service pressured him to complete the report. So, 5 months after he started, Langer had to commit everything to paper. After analyzing Hitler's character, he made a number of startling predictions. He said that as the war went against him, Hitler would become more neurotic, and his famous rages would intensify and become more frequent. He also predicted that there would be an assassination attempt by the disaffected officer corps. A year after the report was completed, von Stauffenberg, a colonel in Hitler's staff, tried to murder the Führer by placing a bomb under his table at his Eastern Front headquarters.
The bomb-blasted room where an explosion nearly got Hitler. See's Nazi film pictures the scene. German generals plotted to kill the arch war criminal and make peace, but Hitler was late in arriving here, and in the bomb burst he was only injured.
Hitler survived, and von Stauffenberg and the other plotters were rounded up and executed. But Langer also made a number of more psychologically profound predictions.
His public appearances will become less and less because he is unable to face a critical audience.
On the face of it, this prediction seems illogical. Hitler exploited the propaganda benefits of encouraging a cult of personality. It might therefore seem reasonable to expect that when the country's back was against the war, he'd be out rousing the troops. In fact, Hitler did the exact opposite. He became more reclusive, just as Langer predicted. On the other hand, Winston Churchill made a point of being visible when the war was going against him.
I think it's really quite important to distinguish Churchill from Hitler psychologically. He had the capacity to rouse the nation at its darkest hour, but never seeing such a total identity with the nation that an attack upon the nation diminished him. And what we saw with Hitler, who was carrying within him this messianic self-concept, where it was history had written his role to be the most important leader in the world, when evidence started coming back that was undeniable, that this was not to be, that the tide had turned, this was quite shattering for him. Because don't forget, that messianic self-concept was the compensatory overlay for the profound void within.
Langer was convinced that the conflict would culminate with the complete destruction of Germany. There would be no surrender, no peace negotiations.
The course he will follow will almost certainly be the one that seems to be the surest road to immortality, and that, at the same time, wreaks the greatest vengeance on a world he despises.
In the final months of the conflict, Hitler made it known that total destruction was the Allies' only option if he was to be defeated.
Langer's prediction that Hitler will bring Germany crumbling down around him does, of course, turn out literally to be right, because in the last weeks of the war, Hitler issues his famous scorched earth directive, where the party and the military have to destroy everything. The Allies mustn't get anything. He doesn't mind now about the German people. The German people will starve. I mean, they've let him down. In this sense, I mean, Langer is right, that here is somebody who only really thinks in black and white, life and death. And if you lose the struggle of the races, if you lose the struggle for existence, you don't deserve anything else. Now, whether this is something driven by the nature of Hitler's own psyche, whether this is something which would only have happened with him and not with somebody else, well, that's probably right, but then nobody pretends that Hitler was in any sense a normal politician.
Langer then made a final prediction about the fate of the Führer.
From what we know of his psychology, the most likely possibility is that he will commit suicide. It's probably true that he has an inordinate fear of death, but being a psychopath, he could undoubtedly screw himself up into the Superman character and perform the deed.
Remarkably, Langer made this prediction 2 years before the war ended. The bunker where Hitler ranted and raved in the final days of the conflict is long gone. It was here that Hitler took his own life. With the Russians swarming all over Berlin, he sat with Eva Braun, who he'd finally married the day before. As he bit down on a cyanide pill, he simultaneously shot himself through the head. His body was carried out into the bombed-out garden, doused in petrol, burned, and then buried.
And Langer is spot on in this case. I mean, this is a suicidal personality. He's not somebody who's going to simply give up, lay down his arms and say, okay, let's have an armistice.
One of the most fascinating predictions to me is the manner in which Hitler would bring his end, namely that he would suicide, which was an uncanny psychoanalytic intuition. If you take this notion of the empty self, which has built up this compensatory, grandiose, messianic facade, what happens when that facade is shattered? It's totally intolerable. And this is really, I believe, what Langer was conjecturing, that if his dream of total glory, of total power, were to fail, and that facade of grandiosity was to shatter, underneath this, that empty self would emerge, and that was intolerable for Hitler, and he had to kill himself rather than be confronted by this total shame and total humiliation.
The fate of this top-secret document is shrouded in mystery. We do know that it reached the highest levels in the British Foreign Office. But there, the trail runs cold. Langer was absolutely certain of the value of this profile and the profiling of political leaders in general. In fact, he went so far as to claim that things might have been completely different if the Allied leaders had the report before Neville Chamberlain tried to appease Hitler when they signed the Munich Peace Treaty in 1938.
I would like to believe that if such a study of Hitler had been made years earlier, under less tension and with more opportunity to gather first-hand information, there might not have been a Munich.
Munich gave Hitler a chunk of Czechoslovakia in return for peace. But Chamberlain completely underestimated Hitler's appetite for German expansion.
We regard the agreement signed last night as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
Historians are far more cautious about the value of this profile and the whole discipline of psychobiography.
There are so many other factors that have to be brought into this. There are so many other political, diplomatic, military and strategic calculations. So much of this is entirely unpredictable. The war in 1939, for example, Hitler thought he was just going to be fighting the Poles. All along he thought he wasn't going to fight Britain and France. And suddenly at the last minute the crisis becomes a crisis of European war, not just a crisis of war between Germany and Poland. So even understanding better what makes Hitler tick would be very difficult, I think, for either the people around Hitler to act differently, or indeed for the British or the French or the Poles perhaps to have acted differently as well.
Dr. Gerald Post has no doubts about the value of psychological profiling.
And my strong belief from the very early days in founding the Center for the Analysis of Personality and Political Behavior, is our leadership needs nuanced political personality profiles of every important world leader, but particularly those leaders who really threaten us.
Walter Langer's work predicted the end of Adolf Hitler. But he had no idea that he'd started a whole new discipline in the CIA, the science of the political profile.
We must understand the leaders we're contending with. You can't deter optimally a leader you don't understand. And to relegate, be it a Hitler or a Joseph Stalin or a Saddam Hussein, to a crazy, evil madman, really degrades our capacity to deal with them optimally, because we're not thinking about what pushes them, what makes them tick.
The government of the United States agrees. Since Dr. Post founded his unit, the CIA has profiled every important world leader, up to and including Saddam Hussein.